Objection.
Mr. President, as you know, I try to come down to the floor every week to talk about someone in my state who's making a big difference in Alaska, big difference in their country, big difference in what I believe is the best state in the country. That's just my opinion. I'm sure the presiding officer thinks that his state is the best in the country, but you know, that's why we all are here in the Senate. Of course, Alaska is beautiful, particularly now. The snow is on the ground and the sun is out. It's back out, high in the sky. It's also nearly time for the Iditarod, the last great race, something that Senator Murkowski and I, I'm sure, will be talking about on the floor in the coming weeks. Kicks off this weekend. So we know it's a beautiful, amazing state, but what really makes Alaska such a great place is the people. The people who work tirelessly for causes they believe in. Mr. President, many people don't know this, but Alaska is also incredibly diverse. In fact, Anchorage, my hometown, the state's largest city, is home to the country's 3 most diverse census tracts, racially, nationally, in terms of nationalities. The 4th, by the way, is Queens, New York. So I'll just give you an example. Last week we had this great event called Bridge Builders. It was in Anchorage. It was all the different ethnic communities in Anchorage coming together. I spent a lot of time there on Saturday. So we're very proud of our diversity. We're proud that more than 100 languages are spoken in our schools. Think about that. You want to talk about diversity. We're proud of the foods, the cultural events. We're proud of the unique tapestry that makes up Alaska, and we're very proud of our history. And we are also blessed to have people who work diligently for all of us to keep that history alive. And I can think of no better way to cap off Black American History Month than to recognize someone who for years has been fiercely determined to unearth a very important part of Alaska's history, actually a very important part of America's history. One that transpired in my state, but that greatly influenced our nation during a very critical time. Mr. President, I want to introduce you to Miss Jean Pollard. She is our Alaskan of the Week, and Jean has brought back the story of the African American engineers of the 93rd, 95th, and 97th Regiments who were in the U.S. Army during World War II, stationed in Alaska during World War II. More than 3,000 of these brave soldiers were integral in building what we call in Alaska the Alaskan Highway, the Alaska-Canada Highway, one of the 20th century's greatest engineering feats. So let me tell you about Miss Pollard. Now a retired school teacher, she grew up in Georgia. When she was a teenager, her father, who was in the Army, got transferred to Alaska. Like all Alaskan students, like our good students, our pages here in the Senate, she took a class on her state's history, Alaska history, in high school. And during the class, she learned about how the Army built the highway, the Alaskan Highway, in 1942 to help defend Alaska and America from invasion by Japan. So a lot of people don't know this. Yes, Alaska was invaded and occupied by the Japanese military during World War II in the Aleutian Islands. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So she learned about this. It was a good story in high school. But the most important element that she was taught in high school was actually left out. The highway was only able to be finished because of the more than 3,000 African American soldiers who built it. So after getting a master's degree in education and a minor in history, and after being a decade for teachers, Miss Pollard only learned the story entirely herself when she was sitting home one night on a Friday night watching a PBS documentary about the building of this incredible highway. What did she learn? Well, again, let's go back in time. It's March 1942, 3 months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, And as the war effort was heating up, construction began on the 1,700-mile, 1,700-mile long vital link connecting the great state of Alaska, wasn't a state then, it was a territory, to the lower 48 for the war effort. Soon a massive mobilization followed. About 10,000 Army troops, huge trucks, civil engineers, food, tents, you name it, deployed to start building this road. And then in June 1942, the Japanese invaded Attu and Kiska Islands in the Aleutian Island chains of Alaska, adding a new sense of urgency to completion of the road. So these soldiers worked day and night. 200 bridges, 800 culverts through some of the most rugged terrain on the planet Earth, mountains, rivers, no rests, hard, back-breaking work. And they were able to complete this 1,700-mile road that still exists today, some of you may have driven it, in less than a year. When the road was being built, the military was still segregated, and African Americans in the Army, much like in the rest of the country, were treated as second-class citizens. They were assigned to the toughest jobs on this project, using the worst equipment. In the summer, it was full of mosquitoes, black flies, and mud, swamps. Winter comes early in Alaska. The winter of 1942 was considered one of the worst winters on record since 1906, according to historian Lael Morgan, in terms of how cold it was, and trust me, it gets cold in Alaska, and how much snow there was. The black troops were required to build winter barracks for the white soldiers, while the African American troops lived in tents. When the snow fell, they couldn't get supplies, and some nearly starved to death, Lael wrote. It is reported that some even succumbed to injuries due to the cold, due to fatalities due to the cold. They did so much of the hard work. However, the contribution of these great African American soldiers and heroes were completely almost scrubbed from all the history books. Nobody that Miss Pollard spoke to, social studies teachers, history professors, knew anything about this history. In Miss Pollard's words, they stole that history. The history books wouldn't write it. It was wrong, and she knew she had to make it right. So she went to work. As a teacher herself and a lifelong learner, she knew that bringing the story to the school system was key to keeping our history alive, accurate history. Eventually, she called the historian I spoke about, Lael Morgan, a former Alaskan who was then living in Maine and happened to be featured in that documentary that Miss Pollard watched on that Friday evening. Lael decided to help in a big way. A year later, incredibly, she sold her house in Maine and headed up the Alaskan Highway to Alaska. Together, with the help of a team of others Miss Pollard recruited, they amassed enough materials to give to the school system to set the history right. Now schools across Alaska are putting this story, this real story, into their curriculum. And now she's trying to get it required as part of a course that the university students in Alaska who are studying education have to take. She and her team put calls out across the internet for anyone who was involved in or had a relative involved in building the highway. She was able to track down 3 members of the African American Army engineers who were still alive. She flew to interview one of the soldiers who was 100 years old. Another one who lives in Louisiana traveled to Alaska in 2017 for the 75th anniversary of the highway's completion. Miss Pollard mentioned recently the names of the soldiers she spoke to back then. There was a soldier from Virginia, Sergeant Reginald Beverly, who unfortunately has now passed away. The soldier in Louisiana who came to Alaska in 2017 is Private Leonard Larkins. He has 10 children. The Alaska Highway Project will be bringing him and his 3 sons back to Alaska on August 3rd to help him celebrate his 99th birthday. I'm in the process, Mr. President, of drafting a Senate resolution to recognize all of the members of the African American Army and engineers who helped build the Alaskan Highway, which was so critical to protecting our nation and Alaska. Now, Ms. Pollard describes herself as feisty. Others might describe her as fiercely determined. When the Alaska State Legislature, at her urging, passed a resolution commemorating these African American soldiers who built one of the greatest engineering highways in the world, she was sitting behind some of the state legislators. She heard one whisper to another, "Have you met this woman, Jean Pollard?" The other said, "Yes. She calls me several times a day about this bill." And Julie and I were just with Ms. Pollard this past week, and as I mentioned at the Bridge Builder event in Anchorage, my wife Julie and I, she's very passionate, very persuasive, and we are very proud of her. Ms. Pollard and the team that created the Alaska Highway Memorial Project are on another mission to erect a memorial in a park in Anchorage. They have a design, and they certainly have the will with her driving it, and I have no doubt they will get it done to memorialize this great engineering feat by American heroes who were not treated well by their country. Like the story of how Ms. Pollard brought important history back to our state, the story of building the Alaskan and of the civil rights in the military also has an uplifting message. On October 25th, 1942, less than 8 months after they started, 2 soldiers, one African American, one white, shook hands after completing this highway. And 6 years later, President Harry S. Truman ordered the Army desegregated, 16 years before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and many historians now cite the work and the experience on this Alaskan Highway project and the African American soldiers and white soldiers working together on a really difficult challenge as also helping make that possible, civil rights 16 years later. The Federal Highway Administration calls the Alaskan Highway the road to civil rights. The road to civil rights. Isn't that a great depiction? So, Ms. Pollard, thank you and your team for bringing that history back to us. I am proud to have talked a little bit about that important history for Alaska and America on the floor of the United States Senate. And thank you so much and congratulations for being our Alaskan of the Week. Mr. President, I yield the floor.